Welcome to Sleepy Histories. Tonight, we'll discuss the Salem witch trials. Our story will guide you through the quiet village lanes, past the flicker of lantern light, and the hush that fell over the communities. No gasps or jolts here, just the measured cadence of history's lessons to help you relax. Let the distant toll of church bells and the gentle rustle of old parchment lull your thoughts, guiding you toward peaceful rest. As always, be sure to let us know in the comments what city you're listening from, and please let us know what topics you'd like us to cover in the future. Now close your eyes, breathe in the cool New England air, and let Salem's soft echoes carry you gently into sleep. The bitter winter of 1691 was drawing to a close in Salem Village, Massachusetts, when 9-year-old Elizabeth Parris began experiencing what her father would later describe as odd postures and foolish, ridiculous speeches. The Reverend Samuel Parris watched in growing alarm as his daughter writhed on the floor of their modest parsonage, her body contorting into impossible positions, while strange words poured from her lips. Soon, his 11-year-old niece Abigail Williams joined Elizabeth in these mysterious afflictions, and before long, other young girls in the village began displaying similar symptoms. What began as a family's private nightmare in the cold February of 1692 would spiral into one of the most infamous episodes in American colonial history. The Salem witch trials would consume a community, destroy families, and claim the lives of 20 people before the madness finally spent itself. To understand how a small Puritan village could descend into such chaos, we must journey back to that harsh winter and trace the threads of fear, superstition, politics, and human nature that wove themselves into a noose that would strangle the very soul of Salem. Salem Village in 1692 was not the quaint New England town of modern imagination, but a frontier community struggling with the harsh realities of colonial life. The village, which would later become Danvers, was carved from the wilderness only decades earlier, its inhabitants living in constant fear of Indian raids, disease, and starvation. The community of roughly 600 souls was divided by geographic, economic, and religious tensions that had been simmering for years beneath the surface of Puritan propriety. The village was split between those who lived closer to Salem town, the prosperous port community, and those who inhabited the more remote western portions. The eastern families, led by the porters, had better land, easier access to markets, and generally more wealth. They also tended to oppose the village's efforts to establish complete independence from Salem town. The western families, dominated by the Putnams, struggled with poorer soil and greater isolation, but they were fierce advocates for village autonomy and supporters of the controversial Reverend Samuel Parris. Parris himself was a man whose very presence seemed to inflame the community's divisions. A failed merchant from Barbados, he had come to Salem Village in 1689, after the congregation had struggled for years to find a permanent minister. His sermons were filled with warnings about Satan's presence in their midst, and he had an unfortunate talent for making enemies of influential families. The Porters, in particular, had opposed his appointment and continued to challenge his authority, creating a constant state of tension that poisoned village life. The winter of 1691-1692 had been particularly harsh, with heavy snows isolating households for weeks at a time. In the Parris household, as in many others, the long dark evenings were filled with Bible reading, prayer, and the kind of intensive religious instruction that was the hallmark of Puritan family life. It was during this period of isolation and religious intensity that Elizabeth Parris and Abigail Williams began their strange behavior. The girls' symptoms defied easy explanation. They would suddenly freeze in the middle of activities, staring blankly ahead as if seeing visions. They complained of being pinched and bitten by invisible hands, displaying marks on their skin that seemed to appear spontaneously. They would cry out in apparent pain, claiming that specters were tormenting them. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to lose the power of speech during these episodes, instead making animal-like noises or speaking in what witnesses described as gibberish. Reverend Parris was initially reluctant to seek outside help, hoping that prayer and fasting would cure his daughter and niece. But as the girl's condition worsened and began to spread to other young women in the village, he finally called upon Dr. William Griggs, the village physician. Griggs examined the afflicted girls thoroughly, but could find no physical cause for their symptoms. After exhausting his medical knowledge, he rendered the diagnosis that would set the tragedy in motion. The girls, he declared, were suffering from the evil hand. They were bewitched. The concept of witchcraft was not foreign to the inhabitants of Salem village. The Puritan worldview held that Satan was a real and present danger, constantly seeking to corrupt the faithful and undermine God's work in the New World. Witchcraft cases had occurred throughout New England since the earliest days of settlement, though usually involving only one or two accused individuals and rarely resulting in executions. What made Salem different was the scale and intensity of the accusations that would follow. Once Dr. Griggs pronounced his diagnosis, the pressure on the afflicted girls to identify their tormentors became intense. Initially, they seemed reluctant to name names, but the adults around them pressed relentlessly for answers. Who was tormenting them? Who had made a pact with the devil to harm innocent children? The girls' initial resistance gradually crumbled under this pressure, and on February 29, 1692, they finally spoke the names that would light the fuse of the Salem explosion. The first three accused were women who existed on the margins of Salem village society. Sarah Good was a homeless beggar who had been reduced to wandering from house to house, asking for food and shelter. Sarah Osborne was an elderly woman who had caused scandal by living with a man before marrying him, and who rarely attended church services. Most intriguing of all was Tituba, Reverend Parris's slave woman from Barbados, whose exotic background and knowledge of Caribbean folk practices made her an obvious target for suspicion. The choice of these initial targets was significant. All three were women who had little social standing and few defenders in the community. Sarah Good's poverty and sharp tongue had made her many enemies. Sarah Osborne's irregular lifestyle and absence from church had marked her as morally suspect. Tituba's race, slave status, and foreign origin made her the perfect scapegoat for a community looking to understand how the devil had gained a foothold in their midst. The examinations of the three accused women began on March 1, 1692, in the Salem Village Meeting House before magistrates John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin. What followed was not a trial in any modern sense, but rather a public spectacle designed to extract confessions and identify accomplices. The afflicted girls were present in the meeting house, and their dramatic reactions to the presence of the accused became part of the evidence against them. Sarah Good maintained her innocence, angrily denying the charges against her. When asked to recite the Lord's Prayer, she stumbled over the words, which was taken as evidence of her guilt, since it was believed that witches could not properly recite holy words. Sarah Osborne also denied the accusations, but admitted to having experienced strange dreams and visions, which only seemed to confirm the magistrate's suspicions. Tituba's response was dramatically different. Perhaps recognizing that denial would not save her, or perhaps drawing upon her knowledge of Caribbean spiritual practices, she not only confessed to practicing witchcraft, but provided elaborate details about her involvement with the devil. She spoke of flying through the air, of meeting with other witches, and of being forced to serve a tall man dressed in black, who carried a book in which she had signed her name. Tituba's confession was a masterstroke of survival, but it also transformed the nature of the crisis. Her detailed account of a witch conspiracy in Salem Village convinced the magistrates and the community that they were facing not just individual acts of malefice, but an organized plot by Satan to destroy their godly community. More ominously, her claims that there were other witches in the village, some of whom she hinted she could identify, guaranteed that the accusations would spread. The impact of Tituba's confession cannot be overstated. Where the denials of Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne had left room for doubt, Tituba's detailed account provided a narrative framework that made sense of the girls' symptoms and the community's fears. She had given them not just a witch, but a conspiracy. Not just individual malice, but organized evil. The community now believed they were under siege by the forces of darkness. As word of the examinations spread throughout Essex County and beyond, the afflicted circle began to expand. Anne Putnam Jr., the 12-year-old daughter of one of Salem Village's most prominent families, began experiencing symptoms similar to those of Elizabeth Parris and Abigail Williams. Soon, she was joined by her mother, Anne Putnam Sr., who claimed to be receiving visions of murder victims calling for justice against their killers. The involvement of the Putnam family was crucial to the escalation of the crisis. Thomas Putnam was one of Salem Village's wealthiest and most influential residents, a man whose word carried significant weight in the community. His daughter Anne Jr. would become the most prolific of the accusers, eventually naming 62 people as witches. His wife, Anne Sr., added the weight of adult testimony to the children's accusations and introduced the explosive claim that some of the accused had committed murder through witchcraft. Other young women soon joined the afflicted group. Mercy Lewis, a 17-year-old servant in the Putnam household; Mary Walcott, the 17-year-old daughter of a militia captain; Elizabeth Hubbard, Dr. Griggs's 17-year-old servant; and Susanna Sheldon, an 18-year-old refugee from the Indian Wars. Each new afflicted person brought her own family connections and social relationships into the expanding web of accusations. The symptoms displayed by these young women were remarkably consistent and equally remarkable in their dramatic intensity. They would fall into fits during which their bodies would contort into positions that seemed to defy anatomy. They would cry out in apparent agony, claiming to be pinched, bitten, or stabbed by invisible tormentors. They developed an apparent inability to approach certain people without falling into convulsions, suggesting that these individuals possessed supernatural power over them. Most significantly, the afflicted developed what would now be recognized as a form of mass hysteria or conversion disorder, in which psychological stress manifests as physical symptoms. The young women fed off each other's reactions, with each new symptom or accusation sparking similar responses in the others. The community's intense focus on their condition and their central role in the unfolding drama provided powerful psychological incentives to continue and escalate their performances. The magistrates and ministers who investigated the cases were convinced they were witnessing genuine supernatural phenomena. They had been trained in a worldview that accepted the reality of witchcraft and demonic possession, and the symptoms they observed seemed to match the descriptions found in European witchcraft treatises. The consistency of the girls' accounts and the apparent physical evidence of their torment convinced even skeptical observers that something extraordinary was occurring. As March turned to April, the accusations began to spread beyond the initial trio of marginal women to include more prominent members of the community. Martha Corey, a church member in good standing, was accused after she expressed skepticism about the girls' claims. Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old matriarch of one of Salem Village's most respected families, was named as a witch despite her reputation for piety and charity. The accusation of Rebecca Nurse marked a turning point in the crisis. Unlike the initial targets, Nurse was a beloved figure in the community, known for her kindness to the poor and her faithful attendance at church services. Her family was prosperous and well-connected, and they immediately rallied to her defense. A petition signed by 39 neighbors attested to her good character, and many in the community began to question whether the accusations had gone too far. However, the machinery of accusation had developed its own momentum. The afflicted girls claimed that Rebecca Nurse's spectre was tormenting them, even as her physical body sat in church or lay ill in bed. The doctrine of spectral evidence, the belief that the devil could not assume the shape of an innocent person, meant that the appearance of someone's spectre in the girl's visions was considered proof of that person's guilt, regardless of their physical location or moral reputation. The acceptance of spectral evidence was perhaps the single most important factor in the escalation of the Salem crisis. It meant that no one was safe from accusation, regardless of their social standing, moral reputation, or physical circumstances. A person could be in church, in bed with illness, or in jail, and yet still be accused of sending their spectre to torment the afflicted. This doctrine eliminated the usual protections of social position and moral character that might have limited the spread of accusations. As the number of accused individuals grew, the colonial authorities recognized that the local magistrates were overwhelmed by the scope of the crisis. Governor William Phips, who had recently returned from England, established a special court of oyer and terminer, meaning to hear and determine, to try the witchcraft cases. The court was headed by Chief Justice William Stoughton, a Harvard-educated minister-turned-judge who was a firm believer in the reality of the witch conspiracy. The establishment of the special court marked the beginning of the trial phase of the Salem crisis. Unlike the preliminary examinations, which had been public spectacles designed to extract confessions, the trials were formal legal proceedings intended to determine guilt or innocence. However, they were conducted according to legal standards that virtually guaranteed conviction for anyone who maintained their innocence. The court accepted spectral evidence as valid testimony, despite the fact that only the afflicted girls could see these apparitions. It allowed the girls' fits and reactions in the courtroom to serve as evidence against the accused. It treated the recitation of prayers or biblical passages as a test of innocence, despite the obvious problems with using such methods under the stress of a capital trial. Most importantly, it created a situation where confession offered the only realistic hope of survival. The first person to face the court of oyer and terminer was Bridget Bishop, a woman in her 60s who operated a tavern and had been accused of witchcraft years earlier. Bishop had the misfortune of being an unconventional woman in a society that prized conformity. She wore colorful clothing, had been married 3 times, and was known to argue with her neighbors. She also had the defiant spirit to maintain her innocence in the face of overwhelming pressure to confess. Bishop's trial on June 2, 1692, established the pattern that would be followed in subsequent proceedings. The afflicted girls were present in the courtroom and immediately fell into fits when Bishop appeared. They claimed that her spectre was attacking them, even as she stood before the judges. Witnesses testified about strange incidents involving Bishop that had occurred years or even decades earlier. Unexplained illnesses, mysterious deaths of livestock, and supernatural phenomena that were now reinterpreted as evidence of witchcraft. The use of long-past incidents as evidence created a particularly insidious dynamic. Any misfortune that had ever befallen someone who had a dispute with the accused could now be attributed to witchcraft. A cow that had died mysteriously 10 years earlier, a child who had fallen ill after an argument with a neighbor, a run of bad luck following a business disagreement. All could now be explained as the work of Satan's servants and used as evidence in capital trials. Bishop's refusal to confess sealed her fate. On June 10, 1692, she was hanged on what became known as Gallows Hill, becoming the first victim of the Salem witch trials. Her execution sent a clear message to the other accused individuals awaiting trial: confess or die. The few who had already confessed, including Tituba, remained in jail but alive. Those who maintained their innocence faced the gallows. The psychological pressure on the accused was enormous. They were imprisoned in wretched conditions, often chained and denied adequate food or warmth. Their families faced social ostracism and economic ruin. They were constantly urged by ministers and magistrates to confess and save their souls, even if it meant losing their lives. For many, the temptation to confess false guilt in hopes of eventual release became overwhelming. Yet for others, the pressure only strengthened their resolve to maintain their innocence. Rebecca Nurse, despite her age and frail health, refused to confess to crimes she had not committed. John Proctor, a prosperous farmer who had been accused along with his wife Elizabeth, denounced the entire proceedings as fraudulent. George Burroughs, a former minister of Salem village who had been brought back from Maine to face charges, maintained his innocence even as the evidence against him mounted. The case of George Burroughs was particularly significant because it marked the first time a minister had been accused of witchcraft in the American colonies. Burroughs had served as Salem village's pastor from 1680 to 1683, but had left after disputes over his salary and conflicts with prominent families. His accusation by the afflicted girls was particularly shocking, because ministers were supposed to be God's representatives on earth, not Satan's servants. The charges against Burroughs were also uniquely dramatic. He was accused of being the leader of the witch conspiracy, the black man who had recruited others to serve Satan. The afflicted girls claimed that his spectre had forced them to sign the devil's book and had threatened them with violence if they revealed his secrets. Ann Putnam Sr. claimed to have visions of Burroughs murdering his previous wives through witchcraft, adding the charge of supernatural murder to the list of accusations. Burroughs's trial revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of his character. He was clearly an intelligent and educated man, able to defend himself articulately against the charges. However, he also had a reputation for physical strength that was unusual in a minister, and prosecutors used this against him, suggesting that his strength came from diabolic sources. When he was able to recite the Lord's Prayer perfectly at his execution, something witches were supposedly unable to do, it briefly shook the confidence of some spectators, but not enough to save his life. The summer of 1692 saw a steady procession of trials and executions. On July 19th, 5 more people were hanged: Sarah Good, Rebecca Nurse, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds. The execution of Rebecca Nurse was particularly traumatic for the community, as many continued to believe in her innocence. However, the afflicted girls' continued torments and the court's unwavering confidence in the evidence convinced most observers that justice was being served. Throughout this period, the geographical spread of accusations continued to expand. While Salem village remained the epicenter of the crisis, accusations began to surface in neighboring communities as well. Andover, Topsfield, Ipswich, and other towns found themselves drawn into the expanding web of suspicion. The afflicted girls were often brought to these communities to identify witches, and their success in doing so seemed to confirm the reality of the conspiracy they claimed to have uncovered. The case of Martha Carrier of Andover illustrated how the accusations could devastate entire families. Carrier was known as a strong-willed woman who had not hesitated to speak her mind, even when it made enemies. When she was accused of witchcraft, the authorities also arrested several of her children, using torture and threats to extract confessions from them. The sight of children testifying against their own mother was deeply disturbing, but it seemed to provide powerful evidence of the reality of the witch conspiracy. The psychological toll on the accused and their families was immense. Many of those imprisoned were held for months in terrible conditions, never knowing when they might be called to trial or what new accusations might be leveled against them. Families were torn apart as some members confessed while others maintained their innocence. The economic impact was also severe, as the accused had their property seized and their families were often left destitute. As the summer progressed, the number of accusations continued to grow, but so did the number of people who began to question the proceedings. Some ministers, while not publicly challenging the court, began to express private doubts about the reliance on spectral evidence. Several prominent individuals who had initially supported the trials began to have second thoughts as the accusations spread to include people they knew to be innocent. The case of John Proctor was particularly significant in building opposition to the trials. Proctor was a prosperous farmer and tavern keeper who had initially been skeptical of the girls' claims. When his servant, Mary Warren, began experiencing fits, he threatened to beat her if she continued, and her symptoms immediately stopped. This led to accusations that he was preventing her from testifying against his accomplices. and soon both John and his wife Elizabeth were accused of witchcraft. Proctor's letter from prison, smuggled out and circulated among influential colonists, provided a devastating critique of the proceedings. He described the use of torture to extract confessions, the terrible conditions in the jails, and the corruption of justice he witnessed. His articulate defense of his innocence and his exposure of the court's methods began to turn public opinion against the trials. The execution of John Proctor and 4 others on August 19, 1692, marked another escalation in the crisis. Among those hanged was Martha Carrier, who had been described by Cotton Mather as the Queen of Hell, but who went to her death maintaining her innocence. Also executed was George Jacobs Sr., an elderly man whose own granddaughter had testified against him under pressure from the authorities. By late summer, the accusations had reached such prominent figures that even supporters of the trials began to worry about where they might lead. Lady Mary Phipps, the governor's wife, was accused, as were several prominent ministers and the president of Harvard College. When accusations began to target members of the colonial elite who had previously supported the proceedings, it became clear that the situation was spiraling out of control. The case of Giles Corey presented the court with a unique challenge. The 80-year-old farmer refused to enter a plea when charged with witchcraft, knowing that if he were tried and convicted, his property would be seized by the crown. By refusing to plead, he prevented a trial from taking place. But English law provided a brutal remedy for such situations: peine forte et dure, pressing with heavy stones until the accused agreed to plead or died. Corey's pressing began on September 17, 1692, in a field near the jail. Heavy stones were placed on a board over his chest, and more weight was added gradually over the course of 2 days. Witnesses reported that his only words were "more weight," as he refused to give in to the torture. His death by pressing made him a martyr to many who opposed the trials, and demonstrated the extremes to which the authorities were willing to go to maintain their proceedings. The final executions took place on September 22, 1692, when 8 more people were hanged on Gallows Hill. Among them was Martha Corey, whose skepticism about the girl's claims had led to her accusation months earlier. Also executed was Mary Easty, whose eloquent petition from prison had moved many readers, and whose dignity in the face of death impressed even her enemies. By this time, however, the tide of opinion was turning decisively against the trials. Several of the afflicted girls had begun to recant their testimony, admitting that they had made false accusations. Ministers throughout New England were expressing doubts about the proceedings, and even some of the judges were beginning to question their methods. The catalyst for change came from an unexpected source: the publication of Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits by Increase Mather, one of New England's most respected ministers and the father of Cotton Mather, who had been a strong supporter of the trials. The elder Mather's treatise questioned the use of spectral evidence and argued that it was better for 10 guilty witches to escape than for one innocent person to be condemned. Governor Phipps, who had established the court of Oyer and Terminer, but had been absent for much of the summer conducting military campaigns, returned to find the situation dramatically changed. Public opinion was turning against the trials, prominent citizens were questioning the proceedings, and accusations were reaching into the highest levels of colonial society. On October 29, 1692, he dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer and forbade any further arrests for witchcraft. The end of the special court did not immediately end the crisis, however. More than 150 people remained in jail awaiting trial, and local authorities continued to make arrests based on the testimony of the afflicted girls. It was not until the following year that a new Superior Court of Judicature was established to try the remaining cases under different rules of evidence. The new court, led by Chief Justice William Stoughton, initially continued to accept spectral evidence, but when the grand jury began refusing to return indictments based solely on such testimony, it became clear that the legal community's attitude had changed. Of the remaining cases that came to trial, only 3 people were convicted, and Governor Phipps immediately granted them reprieves. The psychological collapse of the accusation system was as dramatic as its rise had been. Several of the afflicted girls admitted that they had made false accusations, though they offered different explanations for their behavior. Some claimed they had been deceived by Satan, others said they had been pressured by adults, and still others seemed unable to explain their actions coherently. Ann Putnam Jr., who had been the most prolific accuser, would later offer a public confession in Salem Village Church, stating that she had been deluded by Satan and asking forgiveness from the families of those she had accused. Her confession, read aloud during a Sunday service in 1706, was one of the few formal acknowledgments of wrongdoing that would ever be offered by the participants in the trials. The aftermath of the Salem witch trials was marked by a complex mixture of remorse, denial, and attempts at reconciliation. Some of the judges, most notably Samuel Sewall, publicly acknowledged their errors and asked for forgiveness. Others, including Chief Justice Stoughton, continued to defend their actions and expressed regret only that the trials had been ended before all the witches could be executed. The colonial government eventually provided compensation to the families of those who had been executed and to those who had been imprisoned, though the amounts were generally inadequate to repair the economic damage that had been done. More importantly, the Massachusetts General Court passed legislation that officially reversed the convictions and restored the reputations of those who had been accused. The intellectual reckoning with the trials was led by ministers and scholars who tried to understand how their community had gone so wrong. Robert Calef's More Wonders of the Invisible World provided a scathing critique of the proceedings and particularly targeted Cotton Mather's role in promoting them. The book's publication in London in 1700 helped spread awareness of the Salem tragedy throughout the English-speaking world. The trials left deep scars on Salem Village and the surrounding communities. Families that had been torn apart by accusations found it difficult to reconcile. The Putnam family, who had been central to the accusations, gradually lost their influence in the community as others blamed them for the tragedy. The village itself never fully recovered its sense of unity, and many residents moved away to escape the memories of what had happened. The social changes that followed the trials were equally significant. The absolute authority of ministers and magistrates had been called into question, and ordinary citizens had learned that they could successfully challenge their leaders when they went too far. The trials marked a turning point in the development of American legal culture, contributing to growing skepticism about certain types of evidence and certain procedures. The Salem witch trials have continued to fascinate and horrify people for more than 3 centuries because they represent a perfect storm of human frailties and social tensions. The combination of religious extremism, social conflict, economic stress, and mass hysteria created conditions in which rational people convinced themselves that their neighbors were servants of Satan, deserving of death. The role of gender in the trials has been the subject of extensive scholarly analysis. The majority of the accused were women, and the accusations often focused on behavior that challenged traditional gender roles. Women who were too independent, too outspoken, or too unconventional were particularly likely to be targeted. The afflicted accusers, meanwhile, were mostly young women, who may have found in their symptoms a way to gain attention and power in a society that otherwise offered them little of either. The trials also reflected the particular stresses of life in colonial New England. The communities involved were still relatively new, with many residents having lived through Indian attacks and other traumatic events. The Puritan emphasis on seeking signs of God's favor or displeasure in daily events made people hypersensitive to any unusual occurrences. The harsh climate and difficult living conditions created stress that may have made some individuals more susceptible to hysteria. Economic factors played a significant role as well. Many of the accusation patterns followed lines of economic conflict, with poorer families accusing wealthier ones or vice versa. Property disputes, inheritance conflicts, and commercial rivalries all influenced who was accused and who escaped suspicion. The trials provided a way for people to strike back at their economic rivals under the cover of religious duty. The international context of the trials is also important to understand. Witch trials were occurring throughout Europe during this period, and colonial authorities were influenced by European legal precedents and treatises on witchcraft. The Salem trials were unusual primarily in their scale and intensity, not in their basic assumptions about the reality of witchcraft and the proper methods for detecting it. The legacy of the Salem witch trials extends far beyond their immediate impact on the communities involved. They have become a symbol of the dangers of mass hysteria, religious extremism, and the abuse of judicial authority. The phrase witch hunt has entered common usage as a metaphor for any unfair persecution based on unfounded accusations. The physical landscape of Salem and the surrounding area still bears traces of the events of 1692. The Rebecca Nurse homestead has been preserved as a museum, offering visitors a glimpse into the life of one of the trial's most sympathetic victims. Gallows Hill, where 19 people were executed, is now a park, though the exact location of the hangings remains a matter of scholarly debate. Archaeological investigations have provided new insights into the material culture of the time and the living conditions of both the accusers and the accused. Excavations at various sites have revealed details about diet, health, and daily life that help historians understand the context in which the trials occurred. The discovery of artifacts related to folk magic practices has also shed light on the persistence of pre-Christian beliefs alongside official Puritan doctrine. The trials have also been the subject of extensive psychological analysis, with scholars attempting to understand the mental states of the various participants. Some have suggested that ergot poisoning from contaminated grain might have caused hallucinations, though this theory has been largely discredited. Others have focused on the social psychology of mass hysteria and the ways in which group dynamics can amplify individual symptoms. Modern understanding of conversion disorders, dissociative states, and trauma responses has provided new ways of interpreting the behavior of the afflicted girls. Rather than seeing them as either deliberate frauds or genuine victims of supernatural attack, contemporary analysts tend to view them as young people caught up in a complex web of psychological and social pressures that manifested in dramatic physical symptoms. The question of whether any of the accused actually practiced witchcraft remains contentious. While most historians agree that none of the executed individuals were guilty of the supernatural crimes for which they died, some evidence suggests that folk magic practices were more common in colonial New England than official records indicate. The line between acceptable religious practice and forbidden witchcraft was often unclear, and some accused individuals may have engaged in healing practices or fortune-telling that their neighbors found suspicious. The role of Tituba, the Barbados slave whose confession helped ignite the crisis, has been the subject of particular scholarly attention. Her knowledge of Caribbean spiritual practices, combined with her vulnerable position as an enslaved person, made her both a convenient scapegoat and a believable source of information about witchcraft. Her confession, with its vivid details about flying through the air and meeting with the devil, drew on traditions that were foreign to most New Englanders, but seemed to confirm their worst fears about the occult. The Salem witch trials stand as one of the most thoroughly documented examples of mass hysteria in human history. The extensive court records, personal letters, and contemporary accounts provide an unusually detailed picture of how a community can lose its collective sanity and turn against its own members. The trials offer lessons that remain relevant today about the dangers of unchecked authority, the power of fear to override reason, and the importance of protecting individual rights even in times of crisis. As the last of the accused were released from prison in 1693, and Salem village struggled to rebuild its shattered community, the residents could hardly have imagined that their ordeal would be remembered centuries later as one of the defining moments in American history. The witch trials had lasted less than 2 years, but their impact would resonate through the ages, serving as a permanent reminder of what can happen when fear conquers reason and justice yields to hysteria.